For those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Amundsen. I am head of onshore and consenting for Scottish Renewables. We are the trade association for you. And thank you for joining this webinar where we're going to walk through the report framework that we have created working with many of our partners on maximizing net socioeconomic benefit, which is also how we expect you to comply with MPF4 Policy 11C on maximizing net socioeconomic benefit. We are recording this. This recording may be shared, so please be aware. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. My colleague, Katie Berry, will be putting things in the chat for you, including the PDF of this slide deck. I have a number of hyperlinks in the slide deck that you may want to reference. This is also going to be found. It's already found on our website in publications if you want to download this slide deck from there as well. So let's get started. We're going to start with a little bit of a step back on what MPF4 Policy 11C is. Now, Policy 11 and MPF4 is our policy. It is about renewables. It's about all the technologies, including transmission, and it is how MPF4 encourages and promotes and facilitates renewable energy development, both onshore and offshore. This is how MPF4 works to help us balance the twin energy and climate and nature crisis. And Policy 11C is very specific to maximizing net socioeconomic impact. And Policy 11C very specifically references that it is done through employment, associated business, and supply chain opportunities. That is specifically called out in MPF4, and that is the basis of a lot of the work that we do around Policy 11C. You may also be aware that MPF4 has Policy 25, which is community wealth building. These two policies often get conflated, but we have pulled them apart for the purposes of our work and for the purposes of this report to kind of help support you in making it really clear on what you're expected to do. From Scottish Renewables' perspective, Policy 25 around community wealth building is how communities make sure that they are building wealth. This is backed up by the Community Wealth Building Bill, which is really targeted at how local planning authorities are doing that for themselves. And it is about making sure that proposals that come in feed into that. Policy 11C is how renewable energy projects feed into community wealth building. But for our purposes, we see developers as being required to comply with Policy 11C, not Policy 25. And that is a core distinction, and it is one that we are working with a number of local planning authorities on, including Scottish Government, on to make it clear that this is our understanding of what we need to comply with as an industry and what other people are complying with in terms of community wealth building. Now, I will also say that this has been a conversation of debate. I realized last fall that whether we comply with 11C or Policy 25 was something that even practitioners working with renewable energy developers weren't really clear on. So we pulled together a roundtable of lawyers, economists, practitioners to actually hash this out. And this is the position we landed at. So this is the position that this report embodies. So let's talk about complying with MPF4 Policy 11C. So there is currently no Scottish Government guidance. Maximizing isn't defined, but maximizing is a verb, so we have run with that, as we'll get into a little bit more. Local authorities and the Energy Consents Unit must comply with MPF4 Policy 11C, or they must make sure that developers comply with MPF4 Policy 11C. So everyone is required to make sure that this policy is complied with in the planning system. Local authorities have expressed frustration around applying planning conditions related to how they are interpreting Policy 11C. Because there is no defined Scottish Government guidance, as you may have already experienced, local planning authorities are defining it really, really differently from local planning authority to local planning authority. So we had a roundtable that the Chief Planner's Office, that Heads of Planning Scotland, that enterprise agencies, ourselves, Bigger Economics all sat at, to talk about the fact that there's no guidance, it's unclear what we should be doing to comply with Policy 11C, and local authorities there really expressed frustration. They were trying to apply Policy 11C, and they were getting planning conditions kicked back to them from Energy Consents Unit saying, that isn't material to planning. So there's frustration on both sides around this. Local authorities have started to draft their own guidance. You have probably seen the Highland Council Social Values Charter. It was the first of its kind. It came out last June. It really kind of carved a path for how local planning authorities think about how to work with developers to comply with Policy 11C. Morey Council also has draft guidance. They have had a roundtable with industry back in December to discuss this, which is something that the Highland Council didn't do before they released their social values charter in June. And then there's Aberdeenshire that released draft guidance back in December as well, also hold a roundtable with developers in Aberdeenshire specifically, and kind of consulted on their version of what it means to comply with MPF4 Policy 11C. Now, what we will see as local planning authorities are coming out with their guidance is that they consider it a Policy 11C / Policy 25 guidance because of this conflation of both of these policies and the lack of clarity about how to apply this to renewable energy developments. Again, our position is that we comply with Policy 11C. Policy 11C feeds into Policy 25, which is not our responsibility, but that we help support through Policy 11C. Most recently, DPEA also came out with a report on a very specific project, a battery storage application in Aberdeen, around how they are determining maximizing socioeconomic benefit, with the key quote pulled out here, where the reporter stated that they were not aware of any obvious opportunities capable of enforcement through the planning system to further maximize economic impact that have been missed. They then concluded that the criteria of Policy 11C is satisfied. There's a link in this slide deck where you can kind of go and see. This is paragraph 7, if you're looking for it, where you can see the whole paragraph, which talks about how this battery storage application provided a layout of short-term and long-term job opportunities and kind of some local supply chain impact that the project will have, and that being enough for the reporter to conclude that economic impact had been maximized. So the policy landscape has been shifting over the last probably 9 months around this. But let's take a step back and talk about what we're doing with this report. The reason that we created this report, we started on this almost a year ago, with some support from Bigger Economics, around how do we actually talk about these issues. Now, this became important because the onshore wind sector deal has a commitment in it where an EIA report task force was providing guidance for streamlining. This work is almost completed. It is almost ready. It is almost on the Scottish Government website. We're very, very close. But one of the really early recommendations that became clear from their work and the kind of focus groups that they were having with stakeholders is that the socioeconomic chapter really doesn't belong in an environmental impact assessment. So an early recommendation that we knew even a year ago was that the task and finish group was going to recommend that that chapter be taken out of the EIA report in order to streamline it. That said, you are all still required to demonstrate maximizing socioeconomic impact, so that information needed to go somewhere. We then started work on a report framework, something that we created with the goals of a report where developers can put all the work they're doing to support local communities in one place for a specific project that they propose in the planning system, a way to take kind of all those pieces of work that are happening, the jobs, the training support, the apprenticeships, the community benefit, all of the work with the local supply chain, all of that can go in one place where a developer can say, look at all the things we were doing to support your community. That was really kind of missing, certainly in the PR aspect of how developers were engaging with communities, but really having something that a community can take on and look at and actually evaluate Is this actually meeting our needs? Is it maximizing socioeconomic benefit? So this report framework serves as that mechanism. It also allows you to check the box and say, okay, we are showing you how we are maximizing. This complies with NPF4 Policy 11C. And as you can see, the final version of this framework is now available on our website for you to download and start using. So we created this framework. If you were party to the webinar that I hosted back in January around this, that introduced many of our members to this report framework, I requested feedback and said I was going to vet this with a whole host of governmental entities. I have since done that. Has been put before the Planning Architecture Regeneration Directorate. Scottish Government has seen it. Energy Consents Unit has seen it. Attendees of that September roundtable discussion have seen it. Heads of Planning Scotland have seen it. I have, however, not received any feedback from any governmental body. Feedback may still come later. I will be presenting this to HOPS at a meeting that they are having and taking questions at that time. So some feedback may come from that. But to date, we have received no feedback from anyone in government saying this isn't how they would choose to move forward. And in the absence of that feedback, we strongly encourage you to begin moving forward using this framework. It is such an important tool for you with projects that you have kind of on the ground working with communities that even if there are tweaks to it, there's no reason to not start working with this. Which gets us to why use this report. So this is the what's in it for you. Why should you be using this report? Now, you are required to comply with NPF4 Policy 11C. Yes, absolutely. There are lots of ways you could be demonstrating maximizing socioeconomic benefit, but this is really the compendium of all the ways in which you do that, the one-stop shopping that you have to demonstrate to communities, that you have to demonstrate to planning officers, that you have to demonstrate to DPEA if you go to PLI, that yes, you have maximized. You have done all of that. It also answers the question of how a project feeds into community wealth building priorities. So when you're working with local planning authorities and there are questions about, well, how are you meeting community wealth building? This feeds into that and is how you can talk about these are the ways that we maximize socioeconomic benefit and the ways that we are feeding into your community wealth building priorities. This is the way in which you support local strategies to increase supply chain opportunities and jobs. Like those are the areas that NPF4 Policy 11C is really leaning into, is that supply chain opportunities and jobs. Now, Policy 11C requires developers to maximize socioeconomic impact. It does not require you to provide a wish list of benefits that a community might want. So if a community were to come to you and say, oh, you're doing this great project, super, we want housing. You are not required to provide housing. What you are required to do is maximize net socioeconomic benefit. This report is how you demonstrate that. So you may be looking at what local communities are prioritizing in terms of the ways they want development to support the community, but you are not required to check every box. You are, however, strongly recommended to coordinate with local communities so that the things that you are doing around supply chain opportunities, around jobs, around working with communities does help fit into their local strategies. So where communities are also leaning into and investing in those things, are there ways you can work together? That's where we're hoping coordination will really come through in a report like this. This is also the report. This is how you respond to questions about how a project meets local planning authority guidance. So if, for example, you are asked for a project in the Highland Council, are you signing on to the Social Values Charter? This report is your response. We are maximizing socioeconomic benefit. These are all the ways that we are doing that. If you're talking with Aberdeenshire about what their priorities are, this report is where you say, this is how we are feeding into your priorities around job growth and job creation. These are the ways where you can start to have that conversation in the planning process to say, we acknowledge that you want these things. These are the things that we can do with our development. These are the ways in which we can give back to the community. So if we go to the origin of where this came from. It came from Bigger Economics and a framework that they use at our last planning seminar to talk about how to think about the impacts of renewable projects. And they categorize things into 3 different buckets: direct benefits, enabling benefits, and additions to capital stock. And here you can see there's a whole host of things that fall under each. In direct benefits, we have community jobs, we have construction jobs in GVA. In enabling benefits, we have community benefit funds, we have community ownership, land rental, kind of things like that. In addition to capital stock, we have roads and housing and paths and tracks. But how we talk about these benefits, and this is very important because this is really what this report is based on, is tailoring evidence to fit the benefit, right? Direct benefits, you control the outcome of that, right? A community benefit, you can say, we gave X amount of money to this community, they did great things with it. Enabling benefits really are the ways in which you invest in the community and the community delivers that. So it's delivered by others in the future. It's conditions for success. If you are part of the process, you do not control the outcome. And capital formation is similar. You're creating the conditions, you don't control the outcome. And this is an important distinction for how we put this report together. So this report framework is designed to be really flexible, understanding that this was going to be used for every technology in every kind of development. We created a framework that was flexible enough that any development could be used, could use this framework in this report, which means that we have a series of headings that we consider to be pretty evergreen, and then some suggested content that could fall under it, like a guidance note that just helps you understand kind of what kinds of things that heading is meant to talk about and accomplish. Now, obviously, using this report will look really different if this is a battery storage unit in a residential area, will look very different than an onshore wind project in a remote area, will look really different than an offshore wind project and the onshore components of that. So the flexibility is really meant to be this report framework can work for any of these kinds of projects because the headings themselves cover a whole host of things, and there are guidance notes to help you think about what comes under it. It's also meant to be comprehensive. Now, I've said this a number of times. This is the way that we want to be communicating holistically to communities that these are the benefits of this project. So our intention with this, and obviously you can use this however you choose, is it's meant to kind of be a higher level, more of a summary of what a lot of the benefits are. It can cross-reference to other reports like your EIA report, but it's meant for a non-technical audience. So it isn't going to be all the kind of technical work necessarily in this report that you might have for a more technical audience, so that community members can also kind of read this and understand the benefits that they are getting for this proposal. We based this on the onshore wind sector deal commitments. So a lot of the reference and the policy references come from the onshore wind sector deal, but that's just the starting point of this. It will be expanded for other technologies. A lot of the wording in this report framework will be updated as policies are updated, but we intend for the headings themselves to be evergreen so that the headings don't change, but kind of how you might think about the content of that heading will change as policy changes. And this is focused on how projects enable benefits. Now, I've already said that maximizing is a verb. What this report is doing is helping you show how you are doing this work, how the approach that you're using, the process for doing this, as opposed to the outcomes of this work, because you don't necessarily control all the outcomes of this work. So this is really a different way to think about a report. This is very different than your EIAR, which will have kind of a more outcome focused. So what we're doing with this report is really a culture shift, both for developers and for policy planning officers on the ground, to kind of understand that what we're pushing for in this report, how we're demonstrating maximizing, is really the process through which we achieve socioeconomic impact on the ground in communities, but not necessarily the outcome of that because it's not within your control. So let's jump into the actual report itself. Now, what I'm going to do is go through all of the headings that we include in the report and just talk through kind of what's included under each heading. As I said, we expect the headings to be pretty evergreen. How we talk about the policies underneath that are probably going to change and evolve over time, but the headings themselves should stay pretty, pretty well, evergreen. So, in the introduction, what we're really doing is introducing this report to you and to those who will be reading it. So, you could choose to keep the introduction in the final report that you submit if you think it's useful. So, it's going to be what the report is and, what it isn't. Is going to explain NPFR Policy 11C, kind of what it is that renewable projects are required to do. And it kind of lays out how this is a new kind of approach. It explains what enabling benefits are. It explains why developers should not be held accountable for outcomes that they don't control in planning conditions. And it really has an emphasis on collaboration to maximize benefits. This is where we do hope that developers will work with communities on the areas where they are providing economic benefit, those supply chain investments, those local jobs. How are you working with the community to make sure you're meeting the community's priorities and the community's kind of strategic needs around that too? How is that happening together? And there's a how to use this document section. So just explaining how to use this report framework itself. The next heading is the project context. This is where you talk about the context of your project that is really the foundation of what comes into this report. So because projects are really different, I've mentioned an example of a battery storage project in a residential neighborhood versus an offshore project. The context of these projects, the timelines for these projects are really, really different. This is a section where you talk about the specifics of this specific project that you are putting into planning and how the context will then kind of underpin all of the enabling benefits that you talk about later in the report. So things that you might talk about, and these are suggested content that you can put in this section. This is not a box checking exercise, but things that you might want to put in this section, including locational characteristics, why this area, why this thing, characteristics of the regional economy and the skills base. This demonstrates that you have some understanding of kind of what's happening locally and how you can or can't actually support what's happening locally. That will be really important to kind of back up the kinds of plans that you put in place for supporting local jobs, for supporting investments in the local supply chain. Socioeconomic needs, kind of delivery of capacity, appetite of the local community. Again, like this is your understanding of what you're working with for this specific project. And other planned or proposed developments and how you might be coordinating. So if you are developing in an area that has other renewable energy projects existing or proposed, this is a section where you can talk about how you might be coordinating or working with other developers to make sure that you have kind of more impact than your project could have alone. The next section is around report approach to delivery. So because there isn't kind of a threshold, a number, there isn't some kind of very specific thing you are trying to achieve this report. This is all about how you are getting to maximizing socioeconomic benefit. You really have to lay out how you're approaching that. So the kinds of things that we suggest you would include in this section is how what you're doing is bespoke. How does it meet this specific community's needs? How are you understanding the community? Are you really a community partner is what this is asking. It's about how you're innovating. How are you thinking about things differently? How are you thinking about things better? How are you, trying to improve on whatever it is that you are focusing on to show the community that this is a kind of a process, and you will continue to do better as a developer. It's around collaboration. It's the benefits of renewable developments. How are you collaborating with the community to make sure that those outcomes are achieved since you don't control them? It's about transparency. So making sure that you are being really transparent about what your plans are and how you hope to achieve them so that the community has some faith and trust that you will. And again, it's around flexibility. Not only is this report flexible, but because you are providing this so early in the process, so many years before commissioning, being flexible about how the landscape can change and how you're working with that is going to be an important aspect of this report too. So if things do dramatically change, how are you going to approach that? The next section is around the types of benefit. Now, for the purposes of this report, we really based a lot of this off of the Scottish onshore wind sector deal as a model for how we might frame some of this work around maximizing socioeconomic benefits. Most of this will apply to other technologies or will down the road once we put some of the onshore wind sector deal commitments actually in practice. But the areas that this report is really focusing on is around the supply chain. Supply chain is called out specifically in MPF4 Policy 11C. So the supply chain is an area of real focus and investment. It's around developing skills. We all know that there are skills gaps. There's a lot of work happening around filling those skills needs. How are you doing that? How are you working with that? How are you doing apprenticeships? How are you hiring locally? Kind of those kinds of things. It's about empowering communities, right? This is through effective design. It's community benefits, community shared ownership. And the last one is around environmental protection enhancement, which is, something that communities are very keen on understanding how these projects are not just hurting the environment, but really enhancing. So now I'm going to dig into each of these four broad categories and talk about how you can talk about them in this report framework. So starting with supply chain. So at the project level, there are lots of things you could be doing to support the supply chain. Some of the things you might include in this section, and again, this isn't a box checking exercise. This is really kind of picking and choosing the things that apply to your specific project, kind of each specific project. It's really about how you're researching the local business space. How do you understand what is happening locally, what's available locally? How are you working to maximize local supply chain content? How are you working with your tier ones to make use of local suppliers? How you're adopting progressive procurement practices. This is in line with how communities are fulfilling their community wealth building commitments. Progressive procurement practices is a way that you are helping communities align with that. And then how are you demonstrating kind of local, the impact that you're having, kind of the local work that you're doing around supply chain capacity and clusters of expertise? In the onshore wind sector deal, reporting on local content is one of the commitments that the onshore wind sector has made. And this is a body of work that we've been working really hard on here at Scottish Renewables, and we are really close to launching. This is a space that I would really strongly encourage all developers to be looking at, because should this launch as smoothly as we hope it will, this is a really big win. I have full faith that once we've worked out the bugs of how to get this data for local content, and once we at Scottish Renewables have worked out the bugs of how we report on this publicly, this will be something that we will be encouraging all members to do because it is a massive PR win. Ministers care deeply about the investment in local businesses and the investment in local jobs. We don't have a lot of tools for demonstrating that we do that. And in fact, local communities don't believe that industry does. This is our way of turning around and saying, no, as a developer, you didn't hire 1,000 new people, but you did invest in local content. You did spend this much money on local content. It went directly into the local economy. It is a really important piece. If we're working with ministers to shorten planning timelines, we have to demonstrate real value add on the ground, and this is where we do it. So this is a big win once we start reporting on this. It is something that ministers need from us. So I strongly encourage you, if you're not doing it yet, and nobody kind of is because we haven't given you the information and how to, but once we can demonstrate to you how to collect this and how we're reporting on it, this is going to be an area that I think we're going to really want members to be working with us to help us promote so that we can talk about the kind of impact that industry is having. But this is a real kind of winning, this is a winning message for you on the ground. So making sure that how you're thinking about that is in this report is a really important component to demonstrating that you are actually maximizing socioeconomic benefit. So we move on to kind of the skills section. Some of the content that we would recommend be covered in this area is kind of any commitments to progressive employment, recruitment practices, understanding the local labor market to understand the capacity and the skills and the shortfalls, and kind of how you can help fill skills gaps, how you're building relationships with local kind of education and training providers. This is something that really came up very strong in our conversation with Murray Council, was about kind of investing in these kinds of courses and investing in the local jobs and apprenticeships, working collaboratively with kind of all of those kind of delivery partners so that you have solutions to this that are appropriate for the local market that you are specifically working in. So this community should resonate with the community where you are proposing this project. In terms of community empowerment, I will first off say that a lot of this is not material to planning. Community benefit is not material to planning, but this is an opportunity in this report to really showcase this is how you could work with communities. This is how you're going to be providing a community benefit package. These are your community ownership opportunities. This is how you're building relationships and effective governance. This is how you're generating regional benefits, if that's what you're doing. This is how you are collaborating with other developers who might be in the area around community benefit. And a lot of that is happening organically. Now, community benefit is a changing policy landscape. So this will probably be an area within the report framework that will be updated policy-wise sooner rather than later. As you all know, there is a consultation open. Policies may shift and change around this, and we will keep this report updated. But this is the section where you're really talking about this kind of community empowerment. Notice that it comes after the sections around local supply chain and jobs, because those are what really drive economic growth with your projects, not the community benefit. But the community benefit is the money that folks see going into the bank, so they will want to know kind of what is being offered, how are you working with communities. And then finally, there is the environmental protection and enhancement section. Now, a lot of this will be covered in your environmental impact assessment, but this is a more kind of layperson's description of how you're working with local communities to deliver, how you're protecting and enhancing biodiversity, investments in local infrastructure, if you are doing any improvements to community access, to green spaces or blue spaces, how you're planning for the future so that there's a process in place for decision making, and how, again, you're collaborating with other developers. So of the things you could consider including in this section, it is a lot of what's covered elsewhere, but you still want it here because communities care really deeply about how their environment is being protected. So the intended outcomes section of this report, you've heard me say that this is all about process, this is not about outcomes, which is true. But for communities to have faith in what you're putting in place, for communities to believe that the plans you're putting in place will actually have maximized socioeconomic benefit, we would strongly encourage you to think about how you are going to hold yourselves accountable or evaluate how all of your plans actually achieved the kinds of outcomes that you hope that they will, even when you don't control them. So the section is, a section we hope that you will strongly consider and kind of think about. Because I think it will be really important down the road. What I hear from communities often is, you promised jobs, we didn't see jobs. Well, the truth is the developer didn't do the hiring. The jobs came in tier 1 and tier 2 kind of supply chain. But the question is, how did we capture that and how did we report that back to communities? And the answer is we probably didn't, because we weren't tracking that. But this is a place for you to be thinking about, okay, we're making these investments in socioeconomic benefit. How could we think about evaluating if they achieve their outcomes? And they might not. Again, you don't control the outcomes. But I think it's really important to be able to come back to communities, especially communities you want to continue working in, and kind of see how did that work, kind of set out how you might monitor that progress, and have processes for sharing and learning between projects to support continuous improvement. That's the kind of thing that communities are looking for in a good community partner, and something to be thinking about in this report. And finally, the last section of this report is what lays out what you've already heard me talk about, is that renewable energy projects comply with Policy 11C, not Policy 25, community wealth building. However, kind of explaining to the reader, should you choose to keep this heading in your final report that goes to communities, it feeds into community wealth building. You're just not responsible for community wealth building. So this again just kind of sets out the delineation between Policy 11C and Policy 25 for other readers so that they understand the framing of this report. Okay, so we have a final report. What next? You can use it. It's on our website, and we're excited for you to try. If you're wondering, how on earth do I actually create this report? Bigger Economics has been working on a process designed for creating this. Now, as your trade body, we don't endorse kind of one provider over another, one practitioner over another, but Bigger Economics has been with us from the beginning. They created the framework that we've used for this report. So they've done a lot of work in this. And in fact, we commissioned them to finalize this report for us in the last iteration, of which there were many iterations, so that we could really just kind of get this done and nailed down and ready for you to use. So if you have questions, that would be the first place that I would look if I were you. That said, there are other consultancies that will begin working in this space. They just haven't yet because this is so very new, but I'm sure that there will become a variety of approaches to creating this report. Now, Bigger Economics is working with OnPath to create a model. It's the first use of this report that is being used within the planning process, and OnPath has kindly agreed to make this available to all Scottish Renewables members as an example. So if you're wondering, what does this actually look like on the ground? We've got you covered. This is coming later this spring. We're very excited for it, but it'll give you at least a sense of how this could be used in practice. Now, other developers have already volunteered to make their reports available as projects go into the planning system later this year. A number of developers are planning to submit in the fall that will be using the framework and making that a model for us to use as well. So we're hoping to have a variety of different models of how this can work, just to demonstrate the flexibility of the report so that you can see that really does apply to different technologies, onshore, offshore, kind of all of that, that it is flexible enough to do that. That said, we are also going to be iterating in this framework. As we learn on the ground, I promise you there will be lessons learned from those using it, sharing it with us and Scottish Renewables members, us adapting this report to kind of fit some of the learnings on the ground, feedback we might get from Heads of Planning Scotland, feedback we still might get from the Chief Planner's Office. So the framework will be iterated. I say that the final version is ready. It's a public version that's ready. I don't know that this will ever be final because some of the policy context will always continue to evolve. But we will let members know kind of as new versions of this become available as you start your projects in planning. And with that, this is me. If you have questions, I am the person that you come to. But I'm also happy to take lots of questions here. I did carve out about an hour and a half for this webinar so that I could answer a lot of questions. Please put them in the Q&A section if you have any, and happy to answer anything that comes up. Katie, do we have any questions yet?
No questions yet, Megan.
No questions. I have answered them all. This is a miracle. You're welcome, everyone. Here is your report framework. You're welcome to go use it. Just kidding. I will give folks a few minutes to put something into the Q&A section if you have questions about what this is, how to use it, how we're thinking about it, how we're talking to people about it, anything that comes to mind. This is your opportunity. And while I do that, I'm just going to keep talking. This is only been posted on our website as of last month, so probably 3 weeks ago. It is still very new, and we are looking for feedback on it. Hopefully this isn't the first time you've seen it, but if it is, hopefully it makes sense to you. And kind of walking through each section helps you understand that this is kind of really a very flexible report with suggestions of what goes under headings, but this is not a box ticking exercise of your project needs to include these things. It is really meant to be customized specifically for your project and the context of your project.